The microphone went dead mid-sentence. Not gradually. Not the slow fade of a connection deteriorating or the hiss and crackle that signals technical interference building toward failure. Just dead. One moment I was speaking, and the next moment there was nothing. No signal from the room. No sound returning through my earpiece. Just the complete and immediate absence of audio in a broadcast that 400,000 people were watching live. I had been in the middle of a sentence. Not a complicated sentence. A specific one. The kind of sentence that begins with a document name and a date and a figure and moves directly toward a conclusion that the people who had arranged this broadcast did not want anyone to hear. This report proves. That was where it stopped. 4 words into the part that mattered. I sat in the studio chair and looked at the camera. The red recording light was still on, which told me the feed had not been cut from my end. Something between my microphone and the broadcast had been interrupted. Something that was not technically possible to interrupt accidentally. Not at that specific moment, not at that specific word. I set the document on the table in front of me and folded my hands. I had been preparing for 6 weeks. For words in, they had stopped me. What they did not understand was what I was still holding. The studio producer appeared in the doorway within 45 seconds. Not running, walking fast, with the controlled urgency of someone who has been trained to manage crises without making them visually worse for any cameras that might still be picking up the room. She had a headset on and was speaking quietly into it while she moved. The floor manager held up a hand, the signal that we were off air. I stayed in my seat. Around the room, the technical staff moved with the choreography of a team that was either genuinely troubleshooting or performing troubleshooting with practiced precision. Cables were checked. Boards were examined. Someone spoke in a low voice to someone I could not see on the other end of a phone call. I watched all of it. My expression was calm. Not forced calm, the real kind, which comes not from the absence of understanding but from the presence of it. I understood exactly what was happening. I had understood the risk of exactly this kind of interruption before I sat down in that chair. The producer reached me. "Technical issue," she said. "We're working to restore the feed." She said it the way a person says something they have been told to say. I nodded. "Take your time," I said. I left my hands folded on the document. My name is Nolan Fry. I had spent 11 years as an investigative journalist before this moment. 11 years of building the specific professional credibility that makes the difference between a claim and a story. I knew what sourcing looked like. I knew what verification looked like. I knew the difference between having information and having information that could be published, broadcast, or presented in a formal setting without being dismissed as speculation or agenda. I did not speak unless I had proof. This was not a personality trait that had developed naturally. It was a professional discipline built from experience. From the early years of my career, when I had made the mistake of moving faster than my evidence could support and had learned, through the particular education of public correction, exactly what that cost. By the time I walked into that studio, I had been working on this story for 4 months. The evidence I had assembled had been verified by 2 independent sources, cross-referenced against public records, reviewed by a media lawyer, and organized into a documentation package that was complete and internally consistent. I had not gone into that broadcast room on instinct or on outrage. I had gone in with proof. The kind that does not disappear when a microphone goes dead. The kind that was still sitting in my hands. The 4 months of preparation had looked like this. The first 6 weeks were what I privately called the foundation stage. Every claim I intended to make had to have a document that supported it, not a document that was consistent with it, not a source who would speak on background, but a specific, retrievable, dated piece of evidence with a clear chain of custody that placed the information in the hands of the people I was holding responsible. I built a filing system that occupied 3 external drives and a cloud backup, all encrypted, all accessible only through authentication that I controlled personally. The next 4 weeks were verification. I sent specific elements of the documentation package to 2 independent journalists, people I trusted, both senior, both with no connection to the story, and asked them to attempt to disprove each claim. They found 2 minor factual corrections and confirmed everything else. The final 2 weeks were legal review. A media law specialist with experience in public interest disclosures reviewed the complete package and provided a written assessment of its legal standing. I had also, in that final week, made decisions about distribution. Not because I expected to need them. I had gone into that broadcast believing the story would simply run. But because I had been in journalism long enough to know that preparation is not pessimism. It is the thing that survives when optimism fails. The plan for the broadcast had been straightforward. I would present the material in 3 stages. First, the background, the publicly available information that established the context of the story and gave viewers the framework to understand what they were about to hear. Second, the documentation, the specific records, the named individuals, the dated evidence that moved the story from allegation to established fact. Third, the conclusion, the direct statement of what the evidence showed and what it meant for the people and the institution it implicated. I had rehearsed the structure enough times that it did not feel like a presentation. It felt like a conversation I was having for the 100th time, which is the state you want to be in when the conversation is being broadcast to 400,000 people, and you need the clarity to not stumble. The broadcast was the culmination. Everything before it had been designed to make the broadcast unnecessary. I had approached the relevant institution formally, through proper channels, and provided them with a documentation package 6 days before the scheduled air date. I had offered them the opportunity to respond on the record before anything went public. Their response had been a legal letter requesting a delay in publication pending further review. I had noted the letter. I had filed it. And I had gone into the studio on the scheduled day. The moment itself was this. I had moved through the first stage of the presentation cleanly, the background, the context, the framework. The host had been professional, and the questions had been the right ones. The studio felt controlled, and the energy in the room was the energy of a broadcast that was going where it was supposed to go. Then I reached the second stage. I picked up the document from the table, the specific report that formed the cornerstone of the evidentiary package, the one whose contents, when read aloud, would make everything else in the documentation package impossible to explain away. I opened it to the relevant page. I looked at the camera. This report proves silence. Complete, immediate, total silence on my end of the broadcast. My voice vanished from the feed. The host's expression changed, not dramatically, but visibly, in the specific way that a professional broadcaster's expression changes when they receive information through their earpiece that conflicts with what is happening in front of them. I held the document. I continued speaking, not because I expected anyone to hear me through a dead microphone, but because stopping felt like a concession I was not prepared to make. I spoke the full sentence into the silence, and then I set the document down and waited. The official statement came out the same evening. It was released through the institution's communications office at 7:43 p.m., a time that suggested it had been prepared before the broadcast and was waiting for the confirmation that the intervention had occurred. The statement was 4 paragraphs. I read it in full 3 times. The first paragraph described a technical failure affecting a segment of the afternoon's live broadcast and expressed regret for the interruption to viewers. The second paragraph referred to the subject matter of my appearance as containing unverified claims that the institution was in the process of reviewing. The third paragraph described the documentation package I had submitted 6 days earlier as having significant questions regarding provenance and methodology that made responsible public engagement premature. The fourth paragraph made no direct reference to Nolan Fry by name. I noted each element of the statement carefully. Technical issue. That was the language chosen for what had happened. Not sabotage. Not interruption. Technical issue, the universal corporate phrase for something that went wrong that we would prefer you did not examine closely. I saved the statement to my documentation folder with the date and time. It would matter later, not as evidence of the main story, but as evidence of the response to the story. Both things were useful. The reframing began within 24 hours. I had anticipated some version of it. Any journalist who has worked on a sensitive story involving institutions with communications resources and a clear stake in the outcome should anticipate it. The question is never whether a counter-narrative will be constructed. The question is what form it will take and how quickly it will move. This one moved quickly. By the following morning, 3 separate media contacts, people who covered the same beat I covered, people I had known professionally for years, had been briefed by sources connected to the institution. I knew this because 2 of them called me that day, honestly, to tell me what they had been told. The narrative was this. Nolan Fry had been pursuing this story from a place of personal grievance. The documentation I claimed to have was either fabricated or misrepresented. I had a pattern of escalating claims without proportionate evidence. I was, in the precise word used by at least 2 of the briefing contacts, unstable. The third contact did not call me. 3 days later, he published a piece. It did not use the word unstable directly. It used surrounding language that produced the same effect. References to my controversial past claims, to sources who had declined to work with me on previous investigations, to the questions surrounding my methodology. The piece did not contain a single specific refutation of anything in my documentation package. The calls stopped. Not all at once. That would have been too visible, too obviously coordinated. Gradually, over the course of about 2 weeks, an editor who had been enthusiastic about running a follow-up piece became suddenly unavailable. A producer who had expressed interest in a longer format interview responded to my messages with shorter and shorter replies before stopping responding entirely. A speaking engagement I had been invited to, a journalism conference panel scheduled for the end of the month, sent a politely worded message explaining that the organizers had decided to reconfigure the panel's focus and my participation was no longer required. The doors that had been open were closing. Not loudly. Not with confrontation or stated reasons. Just the quiet process of availability becoming unavailability, of professional warmth becoming professional distance. I had watched this happen to other journalists. I had written about it, in fact, the specific pattern of institutional pressure applied through social and professional networks rather than through formal channels. The mechanism that leaves no fingerprints because no individual step is provably deliberate. I had written about it from the outside. Experiencing it from the inside was a different education. I noted each change, each door, each call that did not come, and I continued working. Even people who had told me directly that they believed the story stepped back. This is the part that I find most difficult to describe without making it sound more dramatic than it actually was. It was not betrayal in any active sense. Nobody sold me out or turned evidence against me or publicly contradicted what they had told me privately. They simply became less present. A senior journalist named Owen, someone I had known for 8 years, someone whose professional judgment I respected, and who had read portions of my documentation package and told me directly that the evidence was solid, became difficult to reach. His replies to messages became shorter. He answered my direct calls twice in 3 weeks, when he had previously answered almost every time. When I finally reached him and asked directly what had changed, he was honest. "The story is real," he said, "but the timing is wrong for me right now. I have other things I can't afford to jeopardize. I understood what he meant. I told him I understood. Then I marked his name in my contacts with a note about the date and what had been said, and I moved on. A journalist who waits for every ally to be ready before publishing a story that is ready will never publish the story. The allies were fading. The story had not changed. They had silenced the broadcast. They had not silenced the evidence. This distinction sounds simple. It is also the most important thing I held on to in the 3 weeks between the broadcast interruption and what came next. The evidence existed. It was documented, verified, legally reviewed, and stored in multiple secure locations that were accessible to me and not to anyone who had an interest in its disappearance. Silencing a person is possible. Silencing a microphone is possible. Silencing a broadcast at a specific moment is possible. All it requires is access to the right system at the right time. But a document that has been copied onto 3 encrypted drives and a cloud backup cannot be silenced by cutting a microphone cable. A recording that has been verified and stored securely cannot be made to disappear by releasing a press statement describing it as unverifiable. An email chain, time-stamped and archived, that shows a sequence of decisions made by named individuals on specific dates cannot be rendered fictional by the publication of a piece that uses the word controversial in Nolan Fray's direction. The evidence was exactly what it had been when I walked into that studio. That was the thing I came back to, in the 2 weeks of professional isolation, of closing doors and fading allies and the institutional counter-narrative spreading through my professional network. The truth had not changed. Only who was willing to say it out loud. I went through the files on the 3rd night after the broadcast. Not to review them for new information. I knew the contents thoroughly enough that I could have described any section from memory. I went through them as a deliberate act of reconnecting with what I had and what it meant. Drive 1. The documentary evidence. The reports, the internal communications, the financial records, the meeting logs, organized by date, by subject, by the individual they implicated. Clean. Indexed. Complete. Drive 2. The verification materials. My own notes from the sourcing process. The responses from the 2 independent journalists I had asked to disprove the claims. The legal review document. The formal submission I had made to the institution 6 days before the broadcast, with the delivery confirmation attached. Drive 3. The supplementary evidence. The recording I had made of a specific conversation, legally obtained, within the jurisdiction's requirements, that corroborated the documentary evidence on its most significant point, and the cloud backup, which contained everything from all 3 drives, behind an authentication process that required 2 separate credentials to access. I sat with the full weight of what I was holding. It had survived the broadcast interruption. It had survived 3 weeks of counter-narrative and isolation. It was still exactly what it was. I closed the drives and made one decision. I did not react publicly. This was the decision that required the most discipline. More than the preparation, more than the legal review, more than the waiting. The pressure to respond publicly was constant and came from multiple directions. There was the internal pressure, the simple human desire to correct a false narrative while it was being constructed, to say directly and publicly that Nolan Fry was not unstable, that the documentation was real, that the broadcast interruption had not been a technical failure. There was the external pressure. Journalists and contacts who messaged me asking for my response to the counter-narrative piece, asking whether I intended to make a public statement, asking whether I was planning any further action. And there was the strategic pressure, the sense that silence might be read as confirmation of the narrative being built around me. I responded to none of it. Not because I did not have things to say. Because I had learned, across 11 years of investigative journalism, that the response to a counter-narrative produced in haste is almost always weaker than the original story told at the right moment. Responding to the frame they had built would mean accepting that frame as the relevant battleground. I did not accept it. I continued working, and I waited for the right moment, which I already knew was not going to be a broadcast. The silence lasted exactly 3 weeks from the day of the broadcast. During those 3 weeks, I did 5 specific things. I organized the documentation package into a format designed for digital distribution, not the presentation format I had used for the broadcast, which required a host and a studio and a feed that could be cut, but a self-contained format. A detailed written narrative, cross-referenced at every claim to the specific document that supported it, with the documents themselves embedded and accessible. 31 pages of text. 47 pages of supporting documentation. A 12-minute audio recording with a full transcript attached. I identified 4 recipients. Not mass distribution. 4. A senior editor at a publication with a documented history of independence, and the legal resources to defend publication against institutional pressure. An international correspondent whose outlet was outside the jurisdiction of the institutions involved. A data journalist who specialized in exactly the type of financial documentation that formed the backbone of my package. And a public interest organization that had the infrastructure to both publish and legally protect public interest disclosures. I prepared a cover document for each recipient, specific, factual, explaining clearly what the package contained and what the documentation supported. I set a date. 3 nights after the broadcast. That was the date I had set for myself on the second day of the silence, when the outlines of the strategy became clear. I worked. I waited. The date arrived. At 11:47 p.m. on the 3rd night, I sent 4 emails. Not simultaneously, in sequence, with a 2-minute gap between each, to ensure that the delivery confirmations came back cleanly before the next send. A small operational detail. The kind that does not matter until it does. The emails went to the 4 recipients I had identified. Each one contained the full documentation package, the cover document written specifically for that recipient, and a single line at the end of each cover document. This has been independently verified. All sourcing is documented within the package. I closed my laptop at 11:53. I did not sleep immediately. I sat in the chair in my study and looked at the window for a while. The street outside was quiet in the way streets are quiet late on a weeknight, not empty, just unhurried. I had spent 4 months building what I had sent. I had spent 3 weeks waiting for the right moment to send it. Now it was moving. Not through a broadcast that could be interrupted. Not through a single channel that could be cut. Through 4 independent recipients in different organizations with different legal structures and different jurisdictions, each of whom now held the complete package and the independent ability to publish it. I had not leaked it in the sense of releasing it without control. I had released it with more control than I had ever had. By 6 a.m. the following morning, the first piece was live. The data journalist had moved fastest. Her piece was tight and precise, built entirely around the financial documentation in the package, with every figure sourced and every claim linked directly to the corresponding record. It was not long. It did not need to be. The documentation spoke clearly enough that extensive narrative framing would have diluted rather than enhanced it. The international correspondent published 2 hours later. Her piece was broader in scope. She had written it for a general audience rather than a specialist one, which meant it translated the technical detail of the documentation into language that the widest possible readership could follow. She included the 12-minute audio recording with a transcript displayed in the article body. The public interest organization published a formal disclosure statement with a full documentation package attached and publicly accessible. Not a news article, a disclosure, a statement of what the materials contained and where they could be accessed, designed for the specific legal purpose of establishing that the information was now a matter of public record. The senior editor's publication ran its piece in the afternoon, longer, more formally structured, with the most extensive legal review of the four. It was the piece that the other publications referenced in their second-day coverage. By midday on the day after Nolan Fry sent the emails, all four pieces were live, and the story was moving through every major news channel I had ever worked with. The reaction moved in three phases. The first phase was the immediate response, the people who saw the publications in the first hours and processed them as individuals. Journalists, policy observers, academics, professionals in the sector the story concerned. The response in that first phase was focused and informed, the kind of reaction that comes from people who have the background to understand exactly what the documentation showed and exactly what it meant. The second phase was the public. By mid-afternoon, the story had moved beyond specialist circles and into the general news cycle. The audio recording was the element that drove this. A 12-minute recording is accessible to anyone, requires no technical background, and in this case contained language from named individuals that was, when heard directly rather than described, significantly more damaging than any written summary could convey. Outrage was the dominant response in the public phase. Not the unfocused outrage of a story that produces emotion without understanding, but the specific outrage of people who had just heard, in clear terms, that decisions affecting them had been made in specific ways by specific people, and that the public justification given for those decisions had been false. Questions followed. From journalists. From members of the relevant oversight bodies. From the institution's own stakeholders. Pressure followed the questions. Formal, institutional, documented pressure that came from people with the authority to act on it. The kind of pressure that a counter-narrative piece in a trade publication and a press statement citing technical difficulties cannot absorb. The same people who had stepped back started quoting my evidence. This was the part of the process that I had been through often enough in my career to recognize without surprise, though never quite without a response. The people who had received private briefings from the institution's communications team and had published or broadcast pieces that characterized my documentation as questionable were now, within 48 hours of the full package going public, referencing those same documents in their own coverage. Not with attribution to Nolan Fry, in most cases. Not with any acknowledgement that the same material they were now treating as established fact was the material they had previously characterized as unverified. Just using it. Reporting the figures from the financial documentation. Quoting lines from the internal communications. Describing the sequence of decisions documented in the meeting logs. I watched this happen from a deliberate distance. I did not write about it. I did not comment on it publicly. I did not point it out to anyone who had not already noticed it themselves, because this was not the part of the story that mattered. What mattered was that the evidence was now in public circulation, attributed to its sources, accessible to any journalist or oversight body or investigative authority that needed it. The rest was just the process correcting itself, the way it does. The way it always does when the documentation is solid enough. The emergency session was called on the 5th day. I heard about it the morning of, through a former colleague who was covering the oversight body that had called it. He sent me a message at 7:12 a.m., 3 words. Emergency session today. The formal announcement came through the oversight body's public communications channel at 8:30. The session was described as an urgent review of matters relating to institutional conduct and public accountability, with attendance required from named individuals at the institution whose conduct the documentation described. The session was closed to press, but the attendance list was public. Every name on that list corresponded to a named individual in Nolan Fray's documentation package. I did not attend. I had not been invited to attend. I was not a party to the formal proceedings. I was a journalist who had published a story, and the formal proceedings that followed were a separate and independent process operating within its own authority and structure. But I had submitted the complete documentation package to the oversight body on the morning after my 4 emails had gone out, a formal submission through the body's public interest disclosure channel, with the same cover document I had sent to the 4 media recipients. They had received everything I had. They had had 5 days to review it. The session that convened that morning was convened by people who had read what I sent. They called me back. Not the broadcast. The oversight body session had concluded its initial review, and the convening authority had issued a formal request for Nolan Fry to appear before a working group that had been established to examine the documentation in detail. This was a different room from the studio. A smaller room. No cameras. A long table with 7 people on one side and a single chair on the other. The formality of the setting was different from a broadcast. More contained, more deliberate, with a specific quality of attention that belongs to a process where the outcome has formal consequences. I sat down. I placed my documentation folder on the table. Nobody in this room had a microphone that needed to be live for the conversation to be heard by the people who mattered. Nobody in this room had a communication channel that could be cut mid-sentence to prevent the completion of a statement. This room worked through formal record-keeping. Everything said in it was transcribed. The chair of the working group opened by noting that the session was being conducted on the formal record. She named the documentation package by the reference number the oversight body had assigned it. Then she looked at me. "Please walk us through the evidence," she said. This time, no interruptions. I walked them through it in the same 3-stage structure I had used to prepare the original broadcast. The background, the documentation, the conclusion. The difference was the room. 7 people around that table, each of them with a printed copy of the documentation package that the oversight body had prepared from my submission. Each of them had reviewed it in advance. I could tell from the quality of the questions that began during the background stage. These were not questions of orientation or basic understanding. They were questions of detail and implication, the questions of people who had already done the reading and were now using the presentation to verify their own analysis. I answered each question directly and completely. When I cited a document, I gave the reference number and the page. When I referenced a recording, I indicated the timestamp and played the relevant section from the device I had brought. When I made a claim that was supported by multiple independent sources, I listed each source in sequence with a specific element it corroborated. Nolan Fry had been preparing to present this material for 4 months. In the closed, formal, transcribed environment of that working group, with no microphone that could be cut and no institutional communications team in a position to release a counterstatement before the session concluded, I presented every element of it. They listened. Carefully, seriously, without interruption. The power in the room was not mine, but the evidence was. The working group's preliminary findings were published 12 days after the session. They did not use the word confirmed in the way that a journalist might use it. Formal bodies have their own vocabulary for the process of establishing that evidence is credible and that what it shows warrants further examination. But the practical meaning of the language was clear. The documentation package had been assessed as credible. The sequence of events it described had been assessed as warranting formal investigation. A formal investigation had been initiated. The scope of the investigation encompassed every named individual in Nolan Fry's documentation package, the specific decisions documented in the meeting logs, and the financial arrangements documented in the records I had obtained. The investigation had subpoena authority, the ability to compel the production of additional documentation and testimony that went beyond what I had submitted. 3 journalists who had received the institution's private briefings and published pieces characterizing my documentation as questionable were now requesting access to my documentation package on the record, for use in their coverage of the formal investigation. I made the full package publicly available through a dedicated archive page, every document, every record, organized and indexed, with a usage policy that required attribution to the original sources. Within 48 hours of the investigation's announcement, the archive had been accessed 22,000 times. The resignations came in sequence over the following 2 weeks. The first was the most significant. The person whose name appeared most frequently in the internal communications, whose decisions were most directly documented in the meeting logs, and whose voice was most clearly identifiable in the 12-minute recording. The resignation was submitted to the institution's governing body and announced publicly through a brief statement that cited personal reasons and did not reference the investigation. Nobody who had read the documentation was unclear about what the personal reasons were. The second resignation followed 4 days later. This one was from someone I had not expected to resign quickly, a person whose involvement in the documented decisions was real but less direct, and who had the resources and the legal support to contest the investigation's findings through a prolonged process. The legal support apparently assessed the documentation as too solid to contest successfully. 2 further departures were announced as administrative restructuring. People whose roles in the institution were reorganized in ways that removed them from the specific areas documented in Nolan Frey's package. The formal language of institutional management was being used to describe consequences that the documentation had produced. I watched each announcement without public comment, not from restraint that required effort, from the genuine absence of the need to comment. The consequences were specific, documented, and directly traceable to the evidence. The evidence was speaking. The question came from a journalist I had known for 4 years. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, directly, no message beforehand. She was covering the formal investigation and had been thorough and fair in her coverage. She asked whether we could speak on background for a few minutes about a specific element of the timeline. I agreed. We talked for 20 minutes about the documentary evidence and the sequence of events. She was good at her work. Precise questions, clear understanding of what she was looking for, no attempt to lead me toward a conclusion I had not arrived at independently. Then, at the end of the call, she asked the question directly. "Nolan," she said. "Off the record." "Go ahead," I said. A brief pause. "Did you leak it?" The question was reasonable. The story had moved in a way that was consistent with a deliberate release strategy. 4 recipients, timed distribution, international scope, format optimized for digital spread. A journalist covering the story would eventually arrive at the question. I had been expecting it. I held the phone for a moment and looked out the window. Then I told her exactly what had happened, in the order that it had happened, with the same factual precision I applied to everything I said publicly. I told her the story from the beginning. The 4 months of preparation. The formal submission to the institution 6 days before the broadcast. The legal letter they had sent requesting a delay. The broadcast. The dead microphone at the 4th word of the sentence that would have changed everything. The 3 weeks of silence and counter-narrative and closing doors. The 3 encrypted drives. The cloud backup. The 4 recipients chosen for their independence and their jurisdiction. The 11:47 p.m. emails. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So you did release it," she said. I smiled. She could not see the smile, but it was there. "I prepared it," I said. "I verified it. I submitted it formally to the institution and gave them 6 days to respond. I sent it to 4 journalists and 1 public interest organization whose independence I had assessed carefully." A pause. "But I didn't have to leak it," I said, "because what I sent them was a documented, verified, legally reviewed package of evidence that described real events involving real people making real decisions. It didn't need me to push it. Once 4 independent journalists and an oversight body had it in their hands, it moved on its own. Another pause on her end. "The truth," I said simply, "doesn't need help once you give it enough room." I looked at the window. Outside, the story was still moving. It would keep moving. That was what truth did when it was solid enough.